There we go. Perfect.
All right, great.
Thank you.
Sorry about that. It's a good thing we started a half hour early to test, right? Work out all the kinks. Anyway, all right, well, great. As I said, Paco already introduced me here in the mug. If you see me at PASS, say hi. I'll be at the Hortonworks booth and presenting on HTTP and Windows and digging a little deeper. So don't hesitate to say hi. Love to see you, and hope everybody can make it to PASS. It's always a good time. All right, so today's presentation about Yarn. And Yarn is one of the what I consider the least sexiest things about Hadoop. You know, there's always Hive, there's machine learning, Spark, now there's stuff like Docker and stuff. But what I hope you get out of this presentation is that Yarn is the most important thing that has happened to Hadoop in the past few months. It's really driving what we see as Hadoop adoption, and it's critical to the core HDFS platform. So let's look real quick on why that is, and to do that we need to look back on what Hadoop was. And actually this is what I was encountering when I first kind of started playing around with Hadoop, is that traditionally Hadoop was just two things. It was your storage and it was your compute. So for storage you had HDFS, and for compute you had MapReduce. MapReduce by design is strictly a batch-oriented data access compute platform. As far as batch, if we want to define batch is considered anything that usually has some process that does not have any SLAs, that you expect it to take a very long time, and it runs in sequential order. So you submit a job, and it kind of goes through a FIFO type processing. When that job's done, it goes to the next person. So think of the line at the DMV or something. That is your batch. Early on, it was, it was not it served the purposes of the major, the Googles and the Yahoos of the world, because they didn't care. They were crunching, petabytes of data, and that was what was critical to their operations. As far as SLA is concerned, they were all right with waiting a day or so, and then they were fine with using multiple clusters, or clusters devoted strictly to let's say analyzing web searches, or sharing out a web search type engine. So that was in the beginning, and so we call that traditional Hadoop, or MR1 Hadoop, and that was around the 2006 range. So we're not talking really that long ago, though it seems like it has been a very long time. So around the 2008 time frame, there was at Yahoo there became a need to change that structure to make Hadoop more versatile than simply a batch compute platform, storage compute platform. So there was a JIRA created, MapReduce 279, which started outlining the frameworks of a programmatic model for making Hadoop much more flexible and increasing the amount of workloads, or not increasing the amount of workloads necessarily, but the types of workloads that you could run against HDFS. So this is a good slide. It's from the Yahoo developer. So this shows kind of the development of Hadoop at Yahoo, and keep in mind that Yahoo was the original developer of Hadoop based off the Google file system white papers. And this is kind of what's interesting about this is the hockey stick type adoption that we're seeing. It happened at Hadoop, and we're seeing it in the marketplace now. So it goes from the different different use cases, pretty much a single use case in search and advertising, but then as the use cases increased, there was the necessity to change how HDFS processed data and how you could access data on HDFS. Finally, in 2011, there was a spin-off into Hortonworks. So about 23 engineers from Yahoo began Hortonworks around the 2011 timeframe. So in October 23 of 2013, they came out with Yarn. And now what happened, and this was crucial to the adoption of Yarn in the enterprise, is that now instead of just batch, you now have the capabilities of running interactive and real-time processing against HDFS. And I'll go into a little bit detail about how it does that and why it's different. So when Hortonworks began, Hortonworks was early on committed to, and especially Arun Murthy, headed out the Yarn development project, but also, a team at Yahoo, I believe there's 22 committers now, understood that if Hadoop was going to be adopted in the enterprise, it had to deal with multiple data access processes. Batch just wasn't going to work. So when we think of interactive, think of query, think of SQL queries, around the 2-second time range, or at least we call it like human time. And then the real time, and the real time is this idea of the Internet of Things, of machine-generated data. So this is machine time as opposed to human time. And so now Yarn allows for these different access patterns all on the same cluster. So what we call this now is we call this MR2, MapReduce 2. And this slide was shown at Hadoop Summit this year. And it's just saying that if anybody argues with you that Hadoop is batch only now, they're wrong. It is not a batch only system. So Yarn has fundamentally changed Hadoop. It allows for more workloads. It allows for more data, varying data sets, and provides more value to your investment in Hadoop by allowing for multiple use cases that spread different data access patterns. And what we'll see coming up is that Yarn now becomes the data operating system of HDFS. And what that means is that it becomes the abstraction layer, the processing abstraction layer, and actually it's, we'll talk about it as a resource management tool, and Yarn stands for yet another resource negotiator. It's going to manage different applications running on Yarn. So that does a few things. One, it allows plug-in capabilities into HDFS via Yarn. So now we have things like Scala, Pig, Hive, HBase, Accumulo, Storm, and others. They could be other third-party products that write APIs into Yarn, and then Yarn manages those resources on HDFS. And they don't interfere with each other. So there's a lot of, this doesn't get rid of MapReduce. MapReduce is still a viable method for analyzing data on Hadoop, but now it's just one of many that can be plugged in. So we kind of look at the future as the possibility of having something like a Yarn app store where you can go online and you can pick and choose what applications you have or want to run on HDFS, and they'll plug into Yarn just like an application onto a Windows operating system. And you see Slider there. Slider's coming in HTTP 2.1, and Slider is a way to plug applications into Yarn that are long running. So if you have something like Storm where there's a constant streaming of data and it's a service that never stops streaming data, then that would plug into Slider. So Slider, as opposed to Hive, which is maybe execute a query here and query there, Slider is for those applications that are always on, and they'll plug right into the Yarn and access HDFS simultaneously. So what benefits do they provide? Well, for one, it's better utilization. There's also, like I mentioned, it enables the next generation of vendor integrations. So SAS will be Yarn ready, R and SAP will also work on Yarn. And the ability to run the next generation workloads, mostly around real-time streaming in the Internet of Things. So some interesting points. So some people argue that Yarn is an immature product. And they're not sure if they want to use it. But in fact, Yahoo has been using Yarn in production for quite a while. They currently have 35,000 nodes. The recent data I saw is that they run 26 million jobs per month. And then what had happened is Yahoo actually had over 40,000 nodes, and after implementing Yarn, they were able to remove 11,000 of those nodes while doubling their workload. So they got rid of pretty much the equivalent of an entire data center and then doubled their workloads. And they currently went from, after Yarn, they went from running 500,000 SQL type queries to 25 million SQL queries a month. So it's been proven. So that's not an argument anymore. And then again, what it does is it allows a single set of data, access to single data in multiple processing zones. So you have, some clusters will be, some nodes will be used for batch, some will be used for interactive, and some will be used for real time. And what's important is that this is a single cluster. You're not siloing your clusters. There's no, and we'll talk about this as far when we talk about the data lake and the modern data architecture, is now you don't need to silo your clusters to match the workloads. And in the future, we'll have something called labeling where you can actually attach certain workloads to specific clusters. And this is mostly was geared towards licensing costs. So if you're running SAP loads or SaaS loads, you can label nodes for those SaaS loads and only license those nodes for those products. So quickly, some concepts. There's concepts of an application, which is a temporal job or service submitted through Yarn. So any kind of really process that you're running, whether it's Pig, Hive, or something, becomes an application. And then that application is provided a container, and a container is a basic unit of allocation. So think in the virtual world where you're assigned. So in MR1 there was the concept of slots, and what had happened with slots is if you had a certain amount of memory, then each slot would have a certain amount of memory assigned to it, so you would just divvy up the memory into these hard-coded amount of slots. If you ran out of slots, your job was out of luck. Now there's the concept of container, which is an allocation of usage of resources that are assigned to a particular application at the moment of runtime. So there's no more concepts of slots. As far as a high-level Yarn architecture, you have what is called a resource manager, which is a global master service that manages all the node managers in your node. So resource manager would be on your name node. Your node manager would run on each of your nodes. And the resource manager is basically the scheduler. So the scheduler used to be part of MapReduce, the job scheduler. That's been pulled out of MapReduce and added to this resource manager. Now the resource, then the node manager then is responsible for coordinating individual resources on the node to each application master. So an application master would be assigned to each application. It would tell the node manager what it needs. That node manager would assign those resources, and the resource manager would then schedule those resources. And also we'll talk briefly about hierarchical queues. So Yarn also introduces the concept of capacity scheduler, and there's 3 points of that. There's capacity sharing, capacity enforcement, and administration. So what this essentially says is that you can divvy out in a hierarchical type of format, you can divvy out cluster resources to individual groups or users. So you can say, well, and I have an example here, so you can say finance group gets a minimum of 30% of cluster capacity and a maximum of 40% of cluster capacity, but the user can only have 20% of the total capacity assigned to the finance group. And again, if we look at the data warehouse group, it's a minimum of 50%, a maximum of 60%, but each user has the potential of using 100% of the resources given to it. So think of, in the SQL Server world, think of resource governor. kind of those type of resource policies that you can assign to individual groups on a cluster. And this allows, and this is what's primarily different from MR1, is that if you had a long-running batch job, it could essentially take down your cluster, or at least use up all the resources, and nothing else could run on it until that job completed. In this way, you can limit the maximum that any one group can run, and so everybody theoretically starts to play nicely with each other. Again, you can set limits on capacity, so you can have maximum capacity, hard limits on maximum % cluster use resources, as well as enforce SLAs across business units. And it enforces sharing amongst users, limits the factors, and application limits, so maximum number of applications submitted to one queue. So it becomes a very, as you know, when you went back and you looked at slots and MapReduce, this is a much more fluid type of operation. In addition, these containers that are spun up, these resource containers that are spun up, can be reused by multiple applications. In the past, when a slot was used, those resources would be shut down and then would have to be spun up for the next application. And there was actually quite a delay. I mean, it was in the seconds, 5 to 10 seconds delay just to spin up the necessary resources. When you're talking about thousands or potentially millions of jobs running, that was a significant hit to performance. And that's now been fixed with Yarn. And here's a quick overview of what we see as hierarchical queues. So these are defined within the Yarn config files. So by default, out of the box, you have a root queue that has 100% of the cluster capacity. So that's the default. Within the same config file, you can define additional groups underneath root and then assign them capacity. The capacities have to add up to 100%, as you see. So marketing and ad hoc and data warehouse all add up to 100%. And then within each child hierarchy or each leaf, they also add up to 100%. So that way you can fine grain and tune your cluster for capacity resource capacities. So let's talk about how this affects the modern data architecture that we see today. So again, what we're starting to see then is this this approach where Hadoop, because it allows these multiple access patterns as well as plugins for third-party tools, then it allows for Hadoop, or HDFS in particular, to become a standard staging area for your data. Now, it's not necessarily going to be where your data will ultimately reside forever. It just becomes a very cost-effective and efficient way to store your data, as well as doing any kind of exploratory or iterative processing on that data. Around that then is the other components, we call them the 5 boxes, that make HDFS much more data center tasteful. So this involves security around Knox and Falcon and Kerberos, and operations, which is Embari and Zookeeper, as well as scheduling and data governance and integration, getting data in and out of Hadoop. But at the core is Yarn as the data operating system, which allows for this concept of HDFS as the holding place, as the staging area for all your corporate data. So from there, you have a choice, and I know some of you have probably seen this slide before. So this is really the point of the slide, then again, is that by implementing HDFS in your organization, we're not saying we're going to rip and replace your existing data systems. We're here, we're really here to integrate with your existing data systems, but provide HDFS as a cost-effective way to consolidate your data. Really think of it as a staging area. And if anybody has done any BI work with SQL Server, you know that it can be extremely painful to stage data in SQL Server, especially if you're cost conscious and you're having to stage that data on the same server as your data warehouse or your production SQL Server. And when those ETL runs go, it brings your data warehouse to a halt. Or you at least there is the competition for server resources. So what we suggest, and a very common use case now, is to move that ETL and offload it into HDFS. And that gives you a lot of options now. Both it increases really the time to production for your data warehouse project, because you don't have to really mess with the complicated ETL up front. But it also gives you this idea of where you can run these different access patterns that you normally can't run against a traditional data warehouse. And these include mostly real-time as well as interactive. But the ability to, what HDFS and the Yarn framework will really provide you is to kind of experiment with the data, to mash your data together and experiment in a way that you can't do on traditional RDBMSs or EDWs. Now, Yarn, it says Yarn is a data operating system, and this isn't to say that Yarn is going to become the transactional processing of the future. We're still talking about an analytic framework here. We're not replacing your OLTP systems. HDFS is not. We don't have any plans to make an OLTP system, but what we are trying to do is allow the SQL queries to run much faster and not have to compete for resources against a batch processing or real-time streaming, that they can happen at the same time in order to really fulfill any need within your organization as far as the analytics are concerned. And really, there's a lot of value too in the fact that we're trying to avoid silos. As we know, a siloed data warehouse is anathema. So we're trying to avoid the same thing with the cluster environment, having a single cluster used by multiple lines of businesses in a secure and isolated manner. And this is what we're seeing as far as drivers of Hadoop adoption now, as far as scale and scope. We see a lot of new analytic apps. Actually, it's very confusing these days of the amount of analytical apps that seem to be cropping up. But all they have to do is plug into Yarn, and they can run them. So that gives you options for your enterprise as choice to what you want to run on Hadoop. We can see new types of data coming in, and a lot of these use cases are line of business driven. We see a few case studies that come from IT up, but as we all know, IT really doesn't have any budget. So what they rely on is the ability to prove out use cases for the line of business that may have the funds to apply towards the use case and fund the Hadoop project. Usually the IT folks get it. We understand the value of this data platform and storage platform for analytics and some of the cost savings. But then it becomes an educational and a real kind of partnership with the line of businesses to get them to adopt it. Once they do, though, it really starts to drive this concept of the MDA and the data lake. And they want more of it. They start to find more different types of data they want to bring into it, different ways of accessing data, and they always want to do it faster. So we see this move, almost this progression from a batch where we say, well, okay, just run some stuff, we get some good numbers back. But then they say, well, let's do a little more analytics. Let's try running some SQL on it, and run Hive on Tez. And that's, more ad hoc, and you get good results. And then they're saying, well, you know what? We could really become a competitive differentiator if we could do these things in real time, if we can make real-time changes to pricing or inventory or medical documentation or something like that. So there's always that drive towards speed, and now with Yarn and the multiple data access, it has a way of fulfilling all those requirements in the enterprise. And this goes back to when a new approach to Insight is really anyone who has been on a BI project knows that the project is very linear. Usually there's already reports created, and you try to, in the goal of the BI project, is to reproduce those reports at the end of the BI project. Maybe hundreds of $1,000s later, and months later, and maybe you get the same result that you had before. And it's a very linear process, right? Determine a list of questions, design solutions, ETL the data, structure it, put it in, and get the and then you may start asking additional questions. But each additional question you ask may or may not require changes to the schema and to the structure, which affects everything down the line, especially the ETL. What Hadoop allows you to do is it's much more it's much more interactive. It's much more life cycle orientated. You're able to change data on the fly. You're able to pull in data that you think you might need, manipulate it, schematize it the way you think. If you don't like it, you just delete it. You don't break any ETL. Applications don't break. Now, that's not to say you still have to. There's still work to be done, but I see it as much more creative, much more interactive. If you're a techie, you love it because you can really dig into it. You can be very proactive about it and creative in the way you analyze the data and the data you bring in, the data you mash together. I was recently at a client, and they were complaining that they wanted to bring some data in, but it would require creating a table in SQL Server that was about 1,000 columns. And they just, obviously you don't want to do that. In Hadoop, that's very possible. I mean, you can create an HBase table with 1,000 columns. It really doesn't affect anything. And if you create it and you don't like it, then you can start over. The data's still going to be there. It's not going to change. And then again, Yarn goes back to allowing you to access that same data in many. You can access that 1,000-column data. You can run batch against it. You can run interactive SQL queries against it, as well as if you want to run some real-time processing on it. Now this slide I found important. I like to point out this slide because of the information on the right, the commodity, compute, and storage. We already spoke about the augmentation where you're sharing your analytics with your ETL process, and with Hadoop it's all about the analytics. You're really not, your analytics and your ETL are one, and the ability, I call it ELT. The ability to transform that data is much simpler and forgiving than in your traditional ETL. But as far as just a storage platform, HDFS is a storage platform. I don't think a lot of companies understand this. That it is next to cloud storage in Azure. I mean, Azure storage is just ungodly cheap. It's just incredible. The only thing cheaper is Hadoop, and that's fine. We mostly know that, but I think what's important to notice is the dark gray area, which is the lines, and what that is the deviation in pricing for those storage. If you want to increase the storage amounts or you want to scale, those are the deviations. So those are the range that you may be paying. Depending on what platform or what vendor you choose. With Hadoop, and this is what I find most, and Yarn helps do this, is Hadoop is extremely scalable. It's linearly scalable both in price and compute. So what I tell people is if you have 4 nodes and you want your jobs to run 4 times or twice as fast, you double the amount of nodes. And pretty much right offhand, that what you paid for those 4 nodes, you're pretty much going to pay from a storage cost, you're going to pay the exact same thing for another 4 nodes. So enterprises love that because it's very predictable. The model is extremely predictable, and you know exactly what you're going to need. And with Yarn and its ability to optimize resource allocation to applications, it just accelerates that and allows you to do a lot more on a lot less. And again, I just want to point out too, through the Yarn, is this is really what our core tenet is we believe that if you implement Hadoop, you should not have to sacrifice investments in current infrastructure and tools that you use in order to access that data. So the same Power BI, Excel that you're running today on SQL Server, you should be able, you can run on Hadoop, and with everything else. As far as Microsoft's concerned, some really exciting things that I'm not sure most people know about is that System Center has a management pack for Hadoop, so you can manage and monitor Hadoop through System Center. So some really exciting things. There's some movement with .NET and Visual Studio as far as being able to program against Hadoop. Again, this is all about being able to plug into this Yarn operating system and allowing partners to take the initiative and write APIs into Yarn so that it runs on Hadoop. And so what we do is we're the only distribution that has a Yarn-ready certified technology partner platform. So you know that if you see these labels on your vendors list, either Hortonworks certified technology partner or especially Yarn ready, you know that that product has been tested extensively to run again on Yarn against Hadoop. So these are examples of some of the ones we currently have, and we're getting more and more each day. Like Docker and Kubernetes was a recent one. So really exciting stuff. So if you want to learn more, we of course have Hortonworks University, which is a great option. We can come on site for students. I think it's 10 or more students. And then there's also online classes. I think starting next year we're going to have more of like a learn at your own pace course, which will be really exciting. And then of course there's always the sandbox. Actually with Hortonworks University, I believe there is a class just on Yarn. Most people, if you're just going to run Hadoop, most likely you won't have to deal, Yarn is just going to be something that's there. It's going to be, it's just going to work for you. It's already out of the box, running. You may do some configuration changes for the capacity scheduler and things like that, but most people aren't going to sit down and code an application to work on Yarn. I'm not discouraging you from doing it, but it's just not going to be, if you're a software vendor, then you might do it. But just know that Yarn just allows out of the box this capability of multiple data access. But there is a course on Yarn if you want to learn more. And then of course there's our Sandbox. Sandbox is free. It runs on either VMware or VirtualBox or Hyper-V. It comes with a bunch of tutorials, sample data, and everything else. It's a good way to get up and running and start playing. So just a reminder, complete an evaluation and enter to win an Amazon gift card, and I am open for questions.
Great. So that was a really nice session. When you leave the meeting, you're going to have a survey, and answering the survey, filling the survey, allows you to enter the raffle. Let's go for questions. We got really interesting questions going on. Scott, you can look at the question window, but I will also read it for you. So Bill Ramos is asking, I'm using the latest version of HD Insight. So with the new Yarn, does this mean my Hive jobs simply run faster than before?
No. So HD Insight is a little different. So you will be able to. So
I got the highlights for the new version of HD Insight in case you want me to read them before you answer, Scott.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
So right now, the HD Insight version 3.1 uses 2.1 Hortonworks data platform, HTTP 2.1, and for Hive, it says that your query performance may be up to 40 times faster and data compression up to 80% using optimized row columnar, ORC.
Yeah, org files. Yeah. So Hive, there's a lot about Hive that makes it run faster, and Yarn is just one of it. So Yarn will make it run faster in the sense of it will spin up, it'll keep containers running for multiple Yarn queries. It'll also just allocate resources better for the it'll pre-allocate resources for your queries. Now the org files. Anytime you run Hive queries, you're gonna want to use org files. So when you create a Hive table, you want to store it as an org file. That's the most efficient way of storing data for Hive, or schematizing Hive data. And that is actually a technology written and open sourced by Microsoft.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So we got Vipul Jaggi. He's asking, is there any preference or advantage of processing structured data through Hadoop versus traditional data processing?
Processing structured data?
Yes, structured data.
Really the main reason you would want to process, now there's nothing wrong with it, obviously. So I would say there's two ways. Is maybe you want to offload some of the development work onto Hadoop. So if you, I know companies that actually do reporting off structured data off of Hadoop, so they don't tax their SQL systems or their OLTP systems with reports. So they'll move data. It may not be in real time, it may be batched, older data, but they can run reports directly off HDFS. The other reason you would want to do that is if you want to mash that data with other more unstructured or semi-structured data that you wouldn't be able to normally see in the relational system. So there's one company that had data that was very structured and data very unstructured, and they were spending a lot of time trying to get that data connected, and they were spending more time trying to get it connected and less time on actually developing the algorithms to get valuable insight. So HDFS provided them a means to store both that types of data in one place so they have it ready and they can start writing their algorithms. Hope that
Great.
helps.
Thank you. So we got Dr. Mark Tabladillo asking 3 questions here, so we gotta be careful. Scott, you mentioned Yarn being a replacement for SQL Server data warehouses. In what scenarios do you see people replacing NoSQL analysis services all up cubes with Yarn?
No, I want to make sure that I'm clear that I never said replace. Again, I said we don't want to rip and replace current structures. So right now, as far as analysis services, there's no equivalent of a cube in HDFS. So if you still want to run cubes, you would still have to use analysis services. And I'm not sure, but there is no, there's no equivalent MDX query capacity in HDFS. Now, what companies have done is they have built dimensional models in HDFS. So they've built fact tables and dimensional tables, and they create Hive views on top of that and query those Hive views. The benefits of doing that is you can query using Hive petabytes of data, if that's what you want to do, if that's how much data you have. And it's going to be very efficient, especially if it's parallelized across a number of servers. The other thing that you avoid by doing that is you also avoid the costly cube building process that may not be meeting current SLAs. So you don't have to you don't have to process the cubes before analyzing the data. Now, with that being said, because of the cube building process and the compression and everything that cubes offer, you're probably not going to get better performance than what you would get in a cube.
Great answer.
Yep.
All right. Mark Tabladillo, you mentioned schema and read to be a major feature of Yarn. So you also said that techies will like it. Business users are already challenged with hard schemas surface to pivot tables. So in what scenario are business users ready for polymorphic access? Polymorphic access.
What are they ready for it?
In what scenarios are business users ready for polymorphic access?
Well, schema on read is a major feature of Hadoop. So that's really a primary tenet of Hadoop. It's a schema on read as opposed to schema on write. Techies do like it because as somebody who has been through a lot of ETL projects, they were horribly painful. I'm much better off, and I'm a procrastinator, by profession, and so I would prefer to just get the data in there as fast as I can and then worry about the ETL. You worry about the schema later, so that's just my preference. But challenge with hard schema service to pivot. So what's our business users ready for polymorphic access? Well, business users are doing polymorphic access now. So and they mostly do it around Microsoft's PDW or APS as Polybase, which allows for access at the same time with a single query access to your relational systems as well as to HDFS data that's transparent to the user. And what's nice too is that you can, so if we go back and say, well, let's move in our dimensional tables and our fact tables in the HDFS, you can run Power BI or Power Pivot against that HDFS schema, and you can do ad hoc querying just as if it was a dimensional table residing in a data warehouse.
Great.
So it's there. Yeah, it's there.
So we've seen prices change over the past 3 years. So over what planning time range do you believe IT leaders can rely on plan pricing into the future? Yeah,
that's really up to that's up to the storage vendor. Well, not storage, but actually the the HPs and the Dells of the world. They have reference architectures. Now, I always tell clients to say, you can go out, you can go to Best Buy, or you can go into your old server closet and pull out a bunch of servers and network them together and build yourself a Hadoop cluster, and you'd be just, you'd get pretty good processing on it. That's one end of the spectrum. The other end of the spectrum, of course, is buying an appliance or something a little more costly, but you do get value for that too. Hadoop doesn't change the rate that storage costs are going up. It may be actually, lowering it a little bit, maybe because it's competitive. But ultimately, it's up to you. I mean, if you have a current vendor, if you have HP, which is a good partner with us, the thing is, though, it's going to drop the overall price of your storage long term because you don't need expensive storage. You can use just simple SATA disk in nearline SAS or something like that. You don't need expensive RAID or SAS disks to run this technology. So you're going to be much more insulated against price increases than you would in a SAN environment.
Great. So Bill Ramos is asking about the same question he did before. So do you think he can assume that Yarn will allow him to have more than one user run Hive queries against the HD Insight server? This was a real problem in prior versions.
Yeah, that's a good question, and actually so HD Insight runs our distribution, but there isn't a direct one-to-one parity. I'm almost positive HD Insight has Yarn. I would imagine so, but that's something I can follow up on. I need to dig. I would assume so.
Yeah. HD Insight latest version is got Yarn.
If HD Insight is running 2.1, then it has Yarn.
Yeah, it's running 2.1 and it's got Yarn, so I will assume the answer is yes to Bill Ramos.
Yeah, and HD Insight usually is parity with the core, HDFS, Yarn, things like that. What it doesn't do is add on some of the other projects like Storm and Spark and things like that, but those are coming. Actually, HBase is now supported, finally, which is cool.
Yep. With Yarn emerging, still deserve spending time on learning MapReduce for beginners? That's direct die.
With Yarn, still deserves some time on learning MapReduce for beginners. That's a really good question. I would say understanding the MapReduce APIs and the other APIs for Hadoop will not be time wasted. So I know at Hortonworks we have no intention of getting rid of MapReduce because a lot of companies have already invested in it, and again, the batch processing still has value for a lot of use cases. But I wouldn't make it the core of your learning. But a lot of the other tools still require some Java capabilities, and those, I think those plug in nicely to. I know at Hortonworks we still recommend a lot of the SEs like myself to get certified in Hadoop development, which involves writing MapReduce queries or code.
Reynaldo Kibel, I'm using SQL Server BI stack for Power Pivot and Power View. Can I go directly to query and generate report from HDFS Yarn?
Yes. So really the magic behind the scenes is simply that HDFS, or more specifically HCatalog, which is the schema for Hive and Pig and some of the other tools, uses ODBC. So you can connect, so you create an ODBC connection, you can download the ODBC driver from the Hortonworks website. You download the driver, you create an ODBC connection to HDFS or HCatalog with your Hive tables, and then you point your Power View and Power Pivot to that ODBC connection. Yep, it's really that simple. And there's actually a tutorial on our website for how to do that.
Great, I've seen it. It's really nice. Will the addition of Docker as a technology partner mean HDP will show up in the Docker official repository? Dave Warner.
Yeah, I would imagine it would. So this is a recent addition. We work a lot. We will work very closely with OpenShift and Red Hat. Red Hat's a big partner of ours. So Docker is now capable. Docker, and I'm not going to claim to be an expert on Docker and Kubernetes, but it is now Yarn enabled. Yeah.
Okay. Let's see. Any P&C insurance companies adopted Hadoop? Any case studies will help us to evaluate for our requirements in the future.
I can follow up on that. I can say we have a lot of use cases. Usually what's best is I will send a note out to our SE team who are all over the country and ask what they're doing in the field. And I'd love to get back with you on that.
Okay, so I have sent to you, Vavala, the bigdatasqlpass.org email. So okay. in case you don't have a Scott email, I will forward it to him.
Okay, perfect.
And that's pretty much it. It was a great session and great questions.
Oh, Bill actually said Spark is available too on HD Insight. So that's cool.
Yep. Yep.
All right.
Okay.
All right.
Thank you very much, Scott. We are going to have the recording of this session on the past Big Data Virtual Chapter website. That is bigdata.sqlpass.org. And we're going to see Scott and Hortonworks back in December, January, and February. Please check the website and your email for updates on the past Big Data Virtual Chapter. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. Appreciate it. Bye.
Please fill the survey you got right now, so you will enter the raffle. Thank you very much, everyone, for coming. Cheers.